Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Draenor as always, and continuing with this series I'm going to take a look at the lore of Warlords of Draenor this time. Now Warlords of Draenor is the expansion everyone loves to hate, and obviously with good reason. As you might guess from the title at least, or if you have watched the previous videos in this series, that is not really the point of the video. The list of dislikes when it comes to the lore of Warlords of Draenor is obviously, again, really long, and the list of likes is a lot shorter, and I could spend an entire video talking about the things I dislike, but again, as a reminder, this video is basically a very opinionated look at just 5 things I dislike about the lore of an expansion, and 5 things I like about it, in addition to a small discussion on what I think of the overall direction of the story of said expansion. Those 5 things I like and the 5 I dislike are not the only things I like or dislike about the expansion. It's just sort of an artificial limitation making me narrow my choices, and you might be surprised that I managed to find things to like about Warlords, but no, there are actually a lot of things I do like about Warlords. Also, the things I will mention are not in any particular order, so it won't be leading up to the thing I dislike or like the most, for instance. And as always, this is just my opinion, you are free to disagree, and I will only address the in-game lore, not expanded universe works which took place in the timeline of this expansion, not that there are particularly many. Now, starting off with the overall direction of Worlds of the North story, it is obviously the threat of the Iron Horde, with initially the side story of Gul'dan and the Legion, which eventually took over, both in the sense that they took over the Iron Horde and that they took over the story. I would also perhaps say that a relevant story aspect, and not just a gameplay aspect, is the garrison and the efforts of the player character's army in this campaign. But let's start off with the premise, since that is relevant to the overall story of this expansion. What do I think of the premise of Warlords of Draenor, of time-traveling Garrosh bringing an army of anachronistic orcs to invade Azeroth? Well, it's not the best of premises for an expansion, it might be the weakest so far, but I have to admit I didn't dislike it, at least not outright. And that's mostly due to the fact that I like orcs and I like orc lore, so obviously this expansion was pretty much made for me, at least when it comes to the premise. And honestly, I did really like Garrosh as a character, despite what you could call the character derailment between Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria, and I was pretty eager to see what they would do with him now. Now, what do I think about the threat of the Iron Horde? To be perfectly honest, despite the Iron Horde being pretty cool and metal and such, it probably is the least impressive expansion-wide threat we've had to face. And honestly, the pre-expansion event was so mediocre when it was supposed to impress upon you just how severe said threat was, that it pretty much soured the entire taste of the Iron Horde in my mouth. Now, even if you don't know the lore, think about the other pre-expansion events. We had the gigantic zombie plague combined with invasions of Stormwind and Orgrimmar themselves to herald the threat of the Scourge. We've had weeks of build-up culminating in gigantic elemental invasions and the entire world being remade to herald the threat of Deathwing. While the Iron Horde got suddenly, overnight, this backwater zone most people didn't really care about got taken over, but the Alliance and Horde are already there and dealing with it. Not a particularly impressive opening. Now, throughout the course of the expansion, I have to say that outside of Frostfire Ridge and Shadowmoon Valley, I also didn't really find the threat of the Iron Horde to be particularly impressive. Now, taking just Frostfire Ridge as an example, you have the Frostwolves fighting with the Thunderlords, while during all this time the Iron Horde is constantly being hyped up as a threat in the background, and you know that if they make it into Frostfire Ridge, you're basically screwed. But after that, you go to Gorgrond, where you don't really deal with them that much. Then you go to Talador, where if it weren't for the cinematic and the pointless death of Orgrim Doomhammer, then the invasion of the Burning Legion in the southern part of the zone would probably have carried more weight. And then a Grand where you are literally taking the fight to them, and the only moment you actually feel threatened is when they spring a trap so obvious at Sunspring Post you wonder how could your garrison be so stupid as to fall for it. And don't get me started on the garrison campaign. Well, I'll talk about it more when we get to the dislikes part. But I have to say, and I am honestly sad to say this, that this expansion, or at least the first half of it, really felt like it was just a promotional piece for the Warcraft movie. It just felt so weird and out of place, pretty much like a filler expansion compared to the previous ones. In regards to the Burning Legion part of the story, I have to say that was much better handled than the Iron Horde story, and was much more interesting, at least in my opinion. I will talk about it more in depth when I get to the likes, but suffice to say, even with the Archimonde retcon, I think it was a positive contribution to Worlds of Draenor's story, and it definitely needed it. Now, starting off with my first dislike, which also ties in with my criticism of the overall story, is that this expansion basically lives in a vacuum when it comes to the Warcraft universe. Every other expansion, even Burning Crusade, which technically didn't take place on Azeroth for the most part, also helped develop the story of the world, but Worlds of Draenor at best helped develop 3 or 4 important characters, and no, just taking part in events without actually contributing to the character's story like Starfang or Gazlo did, for instance, doesn't really count, while the entire rest of the story was focused on the events taking place on Draenor. Now, obviously an expansion is focused mostly on the events of said expansion, and the rest of the world is secondary, but comparing Warlords of Draenor to, say, Mists of Pandaria, Mists of Pandaria was an alliance vs Horde conflict that happened to take place in Pandaria. Wrath of the Lich King provided major developments in the overall politics of the world, not to mention how much it changed and developed a lot of major characters, Jaina, Garrosh, Muradin, just to name a few. Cataclysm was the story of the entire world being remade. Honestly, I think Worlds of Draenor probably should have followed the example of Burning Crusade more closely in this regard, and I know that's saying something when I quite clearly disliked Burning Crusade's lore, but what I mean is, Burning Crusade contained a very present side story of homecoming for the orcs. It was also a long-desired place of pilgrimage for the Blood Elves. For the Alliance it meant reconnecting with the Sons of Lothar, while the Draenei helped their surviving people on the planet. Obviously these exact scenarios are not entirely redoable in Worlds of Draenor, but you really could have focused on another sort of homecoming for the orcs, and our Draenei. Seeing the lands of your childhood before they got so mercilessly destroyed, seeing perhaps once dead relatives alive and in their prime, and so on. That really could have been an interesting story. But the only one who really sees Worlds of Draenor as a homecoming, who gets to see their relatives and interact with them, is Thrall. And I did like Thrall's part in the story, but it's only one character out of so many others. Instead, Worlds of Draenor adopted a different angle, and this is the first like on my list. In many ways, Worlds of Draenor was an homage to Beyond the Dark Portal, not just in the events themselves, but also in the nuances taking place. And my first like related to this is Khadgar's involvement in the story. Honestly, I think that out of all of the characters in Warcraft, outside perhaps of Thrall and Varian, the one most apt to take the leading role in this Beyond the Dark Portal-esque story is obviously a character from Beyond the Dark Portal. I've talked about this before, but honestly I really like not just the fact that they put Khadgar in charge, but what they did with him in Worlds of Draenor, including their rather silly jokes. I mean, come on, he's a teenager stuck in an old man's body, he's bound to be a little cringy at times. Now the next thing I dislike, also tying in with the overall story, is that they really did not utilize all of the setup they've had throughout the expansion to bring the story to its end. And they rushed the hell out of the story anyway, having only one raid patch. You have Grom Hellscream turning to the side of good. Do something with that other than having him auto-attack during the Archimonde fight. You had an entire storyline with the ogres, all the more relevant in the expanded universe since they were making efforts to develop a resistance to fell magic. Do something with that. And the list goes on. The next thing on my like list is the Gul'dan and the Burning Legion storyline. I really liked how Kil'jaeden treated the fact that you released Gul'dan in the introduction. Anyway, like I mentioned, the Burning Legion storyline was a sorely needed backdrop in the first part of the expansion, and was a suitable enough storyline in its own right during the second half. I particularly liked that it was Archimonde and not Kil'jaeden leading the invasion of Draenor, leaving aside the whole retcon demons don't die unless they're in the Twisting Nether thing. I really liked how once Kil'jaeden's typical subterfuge failed, Archimonde stepped in with his brute strength tactics, and I especially like the idea, though it's never stated out loud, that he did so once he found out that the forces of Azeroth, the world he failed twice to conquer, arrived on Draenor, since now it's personal. I also really like the storyline, even though it wasn't really developed upon as much as I would have hoped, of Gul'dan tempting Grom and the Iron Horde, sort of having an angel, in this case Garrosh, and a devil, in this case Gul'dan, on your shoulders. It really is fitting that the snippets we got of this, other than the opening cinematic, took place after Garrosh died in patch 6.1, and honestly that moment when Gul'dan offers the blood of Manoroth again is one of my favorite cinematics in the entirety of World of Warcraft. Though, on that note, my next dislike is the Garrison story. It was just so poorly done and seemed so pointless. In hindsight, it just seemed like a way to get rid of Azuka Blade Fury without giving it too much thought. Now this was meant to really be a shining moment for the expansion, the point where the threat of the Iron Horde really becomes evident. They resurrect an ancient demigod basically, despite your best efforts, and you kill it. Just like that. No fanfare, no secret weapon you had to use to kill it, you just defeat it. Did I mention that this expansion seemed rushed? Anyway, the next thing on my like column is that they really expanded in a positive way the lore of the ogres and of the individual orc clans. They really gave the latter much more individuality and a lot more depth to their respective stories, and for the most part, definitely not for all of them, they handled the named characters of each clan very well, and much of the subtlety of the story of Warlords was concentrated there. On that note, my next dislike is Gul'dan. Now, Gul'dan had probably the most interesting concept out of all of the zones in Worlds of Draenor. The idea of this primal land fought over between the forces of nature themselves, but also occupied by the industrialized Blackrock orcs seemed interesting. But that's pretty much all there was to it, an interesting set of ideas left undeveloped. Now, I did like parts of it, namely the Laughing Skull involvement for the Horde, but overall Gul'dan was pretty much just an underdeveloped blank spot when it comes to the zones of Warlords of Draenor. On that note though, the next thing on my like column is the Spires of Varrock and the Arakoa story. Spires of Varrock, and I am not exaggerating when I say this, has become my favorite zone of all time in all of World of Warcraft. Its story and the story of the Arakoa was honestly my favorite. It's subtle, it's dark, and was tied in incredibly well with the little tidbits of story you had in Burning Crusade regarding the Arakoa. I can honestly say, and I know this is a very controversial thing to say, but to be perfectly honest, Warlords of Draenor, despite all of its plot flaws, was worth it to me because of Spires of Varrock. I suffered through all that with a smile on my face because, if it hadn't been for it, I would never have experienced the Spires of Varrock and the Arakoa story. The Arakoa would have just stayed as a sort of weird side story of Burning Crusade, but they really turned that side story into one of the greatest parts of Warcraft lore, in my opinion. Though tangentially on the topic of the Spires of Varrock, my final dislike is what they did with Wrathion, or rather what they didn't do with Wrathion. I mean, he is, along with Garrosh and Kairos, the instigator of this whole expansion, and all he does is show up mysteriously in weird places and then vanish. It was pretty obvious that they had no idea what to do with him, and they pretty much admitted to that either in last year's BlizzCon or in the BlizzCon before that. I honestly don't remember exactly. Anyway, you have one of the most mysterious and interesting characters in all of Warcraft, instigate the gigantic invasion of Azeroth, and then you have him disappear from the story. Yay. On the topic of instigating the expansion though, my final like is that Thrall got to kill Garrosh. If you remember, there was an entire debate as to who should get to kill Garrosh in the end, with plenty of characters with very valid reasons to do so, and I am very happy that it was Garrosh's creator, both in the IRL sense, haha, and in the lore sense, who got to do it. The scene, the cinematic where that happens, is also absolutely magnificent and filled with both subtlety and just raw emotion and power. If Garrosh had to end this way, leading an army of time-traveling anachronistic orcs to invade Azeroth, then this duel with Thrall was the perfect way to end him. So I suppose this is the end of this particular video. Even though, again, Warlords of Draenor was the expansion everyone loves to hate, I hope I brought a bit more of a nuanced view, though I am certain that my statements regarding Garrosh and the Era Core may be a bit more controversial. Anyway, leave any thoughts in the comments below and I will see you all later. Farewell.